Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to episode 3 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we're going to be talking about id Software. I'm very tired. I've been working on this video for like 42 hours. But you can see there's a lot of effort that goes into these videos and I enjoy making them. So as long as I'm capable of doing it, I will continue to do so. id Software. I never really played many other games because growing up I was kind of sheltered in the sense that my parents wouldn't let me play violent games. Violent games being anything with blood, gore, shooting, whatever. But they would let me play Star Wars games. There weren't really any violent Star Wars games. Oh well. But the story of id Software is one that's kind of sad, and it's about a company that was something that became nothing. And as I grew older, I got to play games like Doom and Wolfenstein, and I really appreciate the company. And then they released Wolfenstein for the PS3, and it was utter boo-boo. But I digress. Even though the story is kind of sad, and we're going to talk all about it today, I've got two amazing streamers who are going to help me accomplish that. The first is Fatal Framerate. Fatal Framerate is a retro variety streamer who tends to stream later in the night, and he plays whatever he wants, like last night he was playing Minecraft. Really awesome guy. If you get a chance to check him out, you should totally check him out. The other person that we have helping out is Game Squad, the toothless nanny of retro, a member and organizer of DGDS, Drunk Games Done Slowly, a charity that I actually participated in last weekend. He is a retro variety streamer that, well, I'm not going to say variety, he's mostly retro. In fact, one of his biggest things he does is retro achievements, which if you've never heard of, is a really awesome concept with achievements pretty much built inside the game. Kind of like Xbox, but better. If you recall back in episode 1, Shoto Bro, who helped out with a Capcom video, he was also deep into retro achievements, but I think he's moved on to something a little bit different. Okay. Well, that's enough out of me. Sit back, relax, and learn the sad story of id Software.
Today, we tell the story of a company that had an impact on the video game industry that lost itself to the ambitions of someone considered a visionary, but we'll get there in a second. The origins of id Software began in 1988 in Shreveport, Louisiana, where a company by the name of SoftDisk was actively making games in a competitive market. In the late 80s, 4 major companies were pushing their consoles to be the greatest of the industry. Sega started with their Japanese and New Zealand exclusive, the SG-1000, but on the same day, July 15th, Nintendo released the Famicom. As time went on, the Famicom would be exported as the Nintendo Entertainment System, and Sega would come back and say, "Hey, fuck you cherries, watch this shit," and release the Sega Master System. Atari tried to do some stuff too with the 7800, but by then Atari was already a blemish on the video game industry, so developers ultimately flocked to making games for the PC as well as the NES. SoftDisk was mainly known for being the birthplace of id Software. The game to come from within the company from these select few individuals was Dangerous Dave. The lead developer for the game was a bright-eyed 21-year-old man-child with awesome hair by the name of John Romero, who was inspired by the platforming elements present in Super Mario Bros. And wanted to translate that to computer games. Another key member of the SoftDisk, by the name of John Carmack, pioneered a system called the Adaptive Tile Refresh, whatever that means, but there wasn't a game at the time that the system could be applied to. So Carmack met with another member of SoftDisk, Tom Hall, and stayed late one night, creating a sort of mod of Dangerous Dave with this new technology, known as Dangerous Dave in copyright infringement. Romero loved it, and it was decided with the visionary ambition of Romero, coupled with the 3D technical innovations of Carmack and the gigantic fucking forehead size of Tom Hall, a new company could be born with the ability to create PC games like no other by secretly using SoftDisk computer after hours, and eventually, after completing some minor projects, pitched their idea to Nintendo. But Nintendo had no interest in expanding their markets to anything other than the NES and Famicom. And even the jump to the Famicom disk system took 3 years and utilized the floppy disk as the medium of choice, which didn't sell nearly as much as the cartridge-based games. However, while Nintendo was significantly uninterested, a software developer, Scott Miller, who worked at Apogee Software, was really impressed with Dangerous Dave and catfished Romero with a bunch of letters supposedly from fans. This was done to avoid the curious eyes at SoftDisk, who were known to screen letters. Romero and his team, known at the time as Ideas from the Deep, developed the first installment of the Commander Keen series and decided to try a new style of marketing. This style of marketing worked by breaking whole games into 3-part episodes, with the first episode being free shareware and the other 2 having to be purchased via mail order. Commander Keen would go on to be a commercial success, and a royalty check was cut to Ideas from the Deep, amounting to $10,500, which is roughly the equivalent of $19,423 in contemporary times. The money was the final piece of the puzzle that Romero needed to create his own development team and depart from Softdisk. February 1st, 1991, the Dream Team developer John Romero, along with 3D tech guru John Carmack and programmer Tom Hall and artist Adrian Carmack, created the company we know as id Software.
From the very beginning of id Software's creation, the dream team of former Softdisk employees hit the ground running, hiring Jay Wilbur and Kevin Cloud, eventually completing 80% of the Commander Keen series with Apogee. However, id Software as a company wanted to branch out their projects to include more than a platformer surrounding a child with an inventive imagination. In fact, Adrian Carmack wanted to create a series that was a more dark style of gameplay, touching on themes people traditionally didn't work with, such as gore and violence. By the time the 90s rolled around, computer games were slowly starting to move away from side-scrolling platformers, and John Carmack, taking inspiration from flight simulation games such as Wing Commander, knew that a forward first-person perspective 3D rendering was going to be the future of gaming. This would lead to Carmack's breakthrough 3D system involving raycasting, where 2D games could be projected on a 3D plane, leading to games such as Hover Tank, a game developed by id Software and ironically published by Softdisk. All in all, the concept was a huge success, as other games that use this system of graphics ultimately suffered due to technical limitations. With the system in place, Romero sat down with his team and brainstormed to see what their next title could be, using Carmack's ray projection system. The team unanimously voted to create a 3D remake of a game by the name of Castle Wolfenstein. The original game, released in 1981, was a stealth adventure that featured graphics akin to what was acceptable during the Atari and Commodore 64 age of gaming, which had its own sequel, Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, again released for the Apple II, MS-DOS, Atari 8-bit, and the Commodore 64. Many of the developers had played the original Castle Wolfenstein, and each member felt that it could align with the interest of the company. John Carmack, who wanted the darker style of gameplay, was 100% on board, and Wolfenstein 3D was created. Initially, Romero wasn't expecting a massive turnout from the game, especially given the subject matter of the game itself. But then, out of nowhere, Wolfenstein 3 became the top-selling shareware game of 1992, with id Software receiving a royalty check of $100,000. And during the peak of its popularity, Apogee was pulling $200,000 a month, while Commander Keen as a series only yielded $10,000 a month. With Wolfenstein 3D gaining traction and popularity, the opportunity for ports to be established were presenting themselves. This would lead to the game being released on 7 different systems. But with popularity, there's bound to be some backlash. The game itself was banned in Germany due to the subject matter of the game, including Nazi imagery. But despite the lack of marketing and translations available to international customers, the game was a commercial success. Wolfenstein 3D proved that id Software had the framework for games that could lead the genre known as the first-person shooter. But Carmack felt that the engine that was used in Wolfenstein 3D could be improved even more than the previous usage. In Wolfenstein 3D, images were projected on a 3D plane, but with the new engine nicknamed the Doom engine, a 3D space could be rendered from a simple 2D floor plan, establishing a continued line of sight parallel to the floor and the ability for graphics to be rendered perfectly, no matter what hardware people were using. However, infighting started brewing among Hall and John Carmack concerning the design of the game, leading to the resignation of Hall. But don't worry, he went on to work at another company by the name of 3D Realms, the company known for the Duke Nukem series. Even with Hall's departure, Doom as a franchise revolutionized the genre, setting the standard for not only graphics, but also graphic violence, which led many customers to worry about violence in video games as well as some of the satanic imagery present in the game. It was also one of the first games to receive the M rating by the ESRB, and even was blamed for inspiring the Columbine High School Massacre. But hey, LAN parties for online multiplayer? You can thank Doom for that.
We talked a lot about the games, but more often than not, the people behind the scenes aren't given a lot of credit. We already know that id Software was formed by John Romero, Tom Hall, Adrian Carmack, and John Carmack. And if you're curious, no, they aren't related. Apparently people with the last name Carmack are just really good at video game shit, I guess. But others included people like Bobby Prince, who was the composer for Catacomb 3D, Commander Keen, Night Raid, Duke Nukem 2, Doom, and others. He was also a first lieutenant in Vietnam. Dave Taylor was a game programmer that worked heavily in making sure that games were accessible to Linux users, and was credited with creating the automap, level transitions, status bar, and cheat codes for Doom. Other than that, he made the cult classic Abuse, courtesy of a company that he created himself called Crack.com. Another well-known id Software programmer was American McGee, who helped for most of the early id Software projects before becoming more well-known for his own series Alice. How about them apples? Shit. Anyway, back to the story. After the success of Doom, id Software knew they had the capabilities to deliver games that led the industry for their genre, and decided to up the ante even more than before. Yet again, like so many times before, John Carmack created an innovative engine, this time using a fully 3D rendered environment, while still allowing for fast action-packed gameplay. This engine would be known as the Quake engine. Quake was a commercial landmark title that raised the bar even higher for competitive multiplayer and had music from Nine Inch Nails. The game won many awards and led to Activision buying a 49% share into id Software, leading to Activision helping with publishing. This business venture would last until 2009. With the in-your-face, non-stop action reputation that id Software had since the beginning of the company, you would think that as a company, everything would have been fine. That they, as a company, would have stuck together and continued to lead the industry with the team members that made the company so great. But the truth is, they butted heads quite often. The first key member to leave would be Tom Hall, who, as we said earlier, was against the level design and overall game experience of Doom, leading to his resignation as he moved on to 3D Realms. After the completion of Doom 2, musician Bobby Prince would go on to work on other projects of his own. Dave Taylor, the programmer, left id after a year of working there to build Crack.com and developed only one game, Abuse. American McGee was fired after Quake 2, but went on to create better games anyway. Sandy Peterson, one of Doom-level designers, departed in 1997 on good terms to work for Ensemble Studios, well known for the Age of Empires franchise. John Romero, who had just finished Quake at this point in time, wanted to drastically change id Softwares and its properties to fit his strict vision, which led to conflicts of interest between himself and John Carmack. Eventually, after months of strict, non-progressive Death March project management, it was decided that for the interest of the company, that John Romero should resign. That didn't stop Romero, though, who created his own company with Tom Hall named Ion Storm, which created the Deus Ex series. The company spent money really quickly, moved into a penthouse, and lived a lifestyle out of their means. Sure, they made Deus Ex, but the only reason they kept their head above the water financially was because Eidos bought out 51% of the company, while Romero would start his slippery slope towards infamy with his next game, Daikatana, where he stated that he would make you his bitch and suck it down. Many people thought the ad was offensive, and ironically, given the aggressive nature of the ad and the hype behind it, it was a massive commercial failure. The game was incredibly busted and buggy, and even with a last-ditch effort to save the company, Ion Storm was closed by Eidos, ending a chapter of John Romero's reign as the King of Doom.
Contemporary id Software is a shell of what it used to be. Even after John Romero left, they were still capable of being a fully fledged company that was capable of developing games. As a matter of fact, while many people left to go to greener pastures or were fired, the three major players that stayed were Adrian and John Carmack and Todd Hollingshed. They led the company through the early 2000s when ZeniMax Media, the same folks who bought out Bethesda, bought out id Software. However, Adrian Carmack, one of the original five, left in 2005 citing legal issues over ownership and even went as far as to sue the company, but the lawsuit was eventually dropped. John Carmack would go on to join the Oculus VR project, leaving id Software in 2013. And speaking about 2013, the last major player, Todd Hollingshed, quit after 17 years with the company that year. The last few people to remain would be Kevin Cloud, Tom Willits, and Marty Stratton, and other lesser-known game developers. All in all, the story of id Software is one of pure ambition, where innovation led gamers on a road to amazing gameplay, but with success comes responsibility, and in a risk-involved environment, you either win or you lose. And in this story, it's unfortunate to say, but many people lost. The memories of Doom, Quake, and for some Commander Keen will always remain in our hearts and in our childhoods. Well, it's that time in the video for us to take a look at the games that made id Software what it is today. Commander Keen. Commander Keen was the first real game developed by id Software, where the company was at the time known as Ideas from the Deep. It was a platformer game akin to Mario, of which Romero cited inspiration from, and much like traditional id Software games, the first version, Commander Keen and Invasion of the Vorticons, was released in 1990 over the course of 3 episodes. The first installment was a call to arms for Apogee, putting them on the map as a video game company. The sequel, Commander Keen and Keen Dreams, was officially the first game developed by id Software under the new company name, and ironically published by Softdisk as opposed to Apogee. Adrian Carmack was credited with making the series work in the first game, and yet again he delivered with his adaptive tile refresh concept. Keen Dreams, however, wasn't nearly as popular as the first entry, and is considered a lost episode of the series. The third entry in the series, Goodbye Galaxy, was published again by Apogee, and it wasn't nearly as popular. The whole shareware style of marketing was slowly dying. It yielded $60,000 by June of 1991, and Apogee's company felt that it fell short because it was only a 2-episode game, where all the other ones were 3. The final major entry in this series was released in December of 1991 by id Software and published by ForumGen, and again, commercially, was unsuccessful. The last game in the series was developed by Activision, and while it was visually appealing, it also wasn't successful. Much like Dangerous Dave, Commander Keen was pretty much the same game every single time, and people just got tired of it. Supposedly a future release is planned, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
Wolfenstein originally was an 8-bit game created by Muse Software that was a stealth-based action-adventure shooter set during World War II. Featuring a top-down perspective, it was inspired by the Atari classic Berserk. The game was followed up by Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, but it was very much looked down on as a game for the era. These two games weren't super successful, but it inspired the key leadership at id Software and led to the revival of the series with their own unique spin. Wolfenstein 3D would be this project, and it would become a staple of creating the first-person shooter genre, often called the grandfather of 3D shooters. It was released in 1992 and was a massive commercial success, which earned numerous awards and set the standard for fast-paced games and breathed a breath of fresh air into the shareware concept. The game would be ported to numerous consoles and would be the subject of censorship in countries sensitive to violence and Nazi imagery. A second add-on called Spear of Destiny would also garner a critically acclaimed reaction from consumers. The next installation would be called Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which is a contemporary spin on the game, released in 2001. It was generally liked by the community, but the most popular aspect of the game was the multiplayer portion. The only major competitor during the time frame was Valve's Day of Defeat, which started out as a Half-Life modification. Intended to be the reboot of the series, Wolfenstein was released in 2009 as a first-person shooter developed by Raven Software and published by Activision. It was average at best when compared to the other entries in the series, and is oftentimes considered a very subpar average run-of-the-mill shooter. The low sales figures resulted in many employees of Raven Software being laid off, and the game has never seen a digital release. However, after the purchase of ZeniMax, Bethesda had an opportunity to publish their take on the genre, with the aid of machine games, and completely revamped the game graphically, yielding an amazing reaction from the community. Wolfenstein: The New Order saw an expansive storyline and sold over €21 million worth of sales in Europe. For those of you that use that green stripper fuel shit known as the US dollar, that equals roughly $26 million bucks. A sequel was released last year, and much like its predecessor, is promoting the same hype and fast-paced action, and people thoroughly enjoyed it, winning the Best Action Game in the 2017 Game Awards.
Doom was born due to the technological genius of John Carmack, who invented the Doom engine in 1993. Assuming the role of an unnamed space marine, colloquially known as Doom Guy, you have to fight your way through hell to kill a bunch of demons. The first entry popularized the first-person shooter genre and led to the networking of multiplayer-style gaming. With the addition of WADs, the game could be modded to present any situation that the developer wished. While it was the subject of controversy for the satanic imagery, much like Wolfenstein was judged for the Nazi imagery, it was a landmark title that still to this day is an amazing game. Doom 2, the sequel, was released in 1995. It was commercially released. Unlike the first game, it even had an expansion pack that included 21 new levels. It was exceptionally similar to the previous title, but that didn't stop people from playing it. The biggest improvement was the multiplayer aspect that allowed for local area network connections. The next entry would be Final Doom, which is a standalone game that features enemies and weapons from Doom 2, but has its own unique scenario. Many people felt that the game was a waste of money and was a direct clone of Doom 2. As a clone, it did not see commercial success. Midway, of all people, began developing a Doom game on Nintendo 64 in 1997. While it was supervised by id, it was 100% created by Midway. Many people have mixed emotions about the game, but traditionally, the entries looked down upon, even by id Software standards. But all in all, it's a decent continuation of the franchise. The series was quiet for 7 years when id Software finally decided it was time to make another Doom entry. Developed by id and published by Activision, the game was a completely refreshing addition to the series, selling 3.5 million copies and becoming the most successful id Software title to date. And yet again, John Carmack was the man that made the magic happen with the creation of the Doom 3 engine, and the game even saw a film adaptation. It was really fucking bad. A reboot, again, was released in 2016 for all contemporary systems, and again was well received. In terms of spin-offs, most of the games were released on mobile platform, but Doom VFR was released for the PlayStation VR.
Shadow Knights, the Shogun of Death. This game is an obscure one, and more often than not it gets pushed to the back burner popularity. It was being developed during the first release of Commander Keen and another game called Slordax: The Unknown Enemy. The engine was the same used for Dangerous Dave, and the game is rather simple. The developers made around $5,000 for its creation, and it plays a lot like Ninja Gaiden, but without the playability. All in all, if you are a true retro PC gamer, definitely check it out for the nostalgia factor.
Hover Tank 3D is a vehicular combat game that was made by id Software and published by Softdisk. The engine was created by John Carmack and featured the dream team of Tom Hall, John Romero, and the two Carmacks. Hover Tank 3D was an early attempt at first-person 3D game, and the engine itself would lead to the engine for Wolfenstein 3D. In fact, everyone during the game development phase stated their pleasure in making the game. Adrian Carmack in particular loved drawing the monsters and evil creatures, possibly foreshadowing his investment in Doom, leading to Tom Hall leaving the company. All in all, the engine was used and abused, and all applications of the engine itself have been memorable to say the least.
Dangerous Dave was the brainchild of John Romero while he worked for Softdisk and drew inspiration from Super Mario Bros. Now bear in mind, the two looked drastically different, and the game did have a really early Apple II platformer look and feel, but the gameplay was smooth and the game was very linear in concept. A 16-bit remake was made for the Apple II called Double Dangerous Dave, and to be honest, it felt like the exact same game, just with a more 90s stylized graphics. The game that really established the concept that id Software could become something real and inspired Commander Keen was in part to the unpublished game that came next, Dangerous Dave and copyright infringement, but we already covered that. The next game was a DOS remake of the original Dangerous Dave that looked better, but it seemed every few months they released another Dangerous Dave game, but to be fair, they were really short games to begin with. The third game to be released in 1990 was Dangerous Dave in a deserted pirate's hideout on Apple II, and it still kept the same style, and it's hard to talk about the game series as a whole because it literally was the exact same game. And what was happening in the background was a lot more interesting than each of the individual games themselves. What's important about this franchise is that John Romero contributed to 8 Dangerous Dave titles before it was handed off to other developers to finish this series, with the last release being in 1995 on the Apple II computer.
Rescue Rover. Before Rescue Rover and Commander Keen were created, Dangerous Dave was made and was successful. When the founding members of id Software created in copyright infringement, thus leading to the creation of Commander Keen, they wanted to try something with different graphics, akin to Super Mario 3. The demo that was created by the Dream Team would go on to serve as the basis of Rescue Rover, which was a simple maze game created for both MS-DOS and Apple II GS. It was a simple game and spawned a sequel.
This game is a mahjong game, otherwise known as Chinese dominoes or something. I was never smart enough to figure out how to play this game, so fuck it. Next game. So this game is one of the landmark first-person games that predated Wolfenstein 3D, and this one is actually pretty awesome. If you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. It's simply a fun game that featured all the bigwigs at id Software while they were still working at Softdisk and fulfilling their contractual obligations. The game spawned 3 more games, all of which were equally as successful and fun.
Orcs and Elves. This one is a contemporary game created under the supervision of Electronic Arts, and it's a turn-based RPG that's played from a first-person perspective. So imagine Ultima or Wizardry with refined Doom-based graphics compressed to the DS and mobile platforms. That's what it's all about. It went as far as to win one of the best E3 awards in 2006.
I've never actually played Rage, and there's a reason. It's because I was writing a book whenever I was a kid that kind of accidentally paralleled the concept of Rage, so I didn't want to play it because I wanted to make sure that my novel, which I kind of departed from, wasn't colliding with the game. Basically, the story is about a Marine that wakes up 106 years after being frozen, and he goes on an adventure in a dystopian future after an asteroid collides with Earth. It's no Fallout, but it's a nice addition to the id Software library.
Heretic is a dark fantasy FPS created by Raven Software under supervision of id Software. It was a derivative of Doom and it was generally well received. Kind of. Here's the issue. Heretic was a fantastic game, but the timing of the release was kinda weird. Ideally, Doom and Heretic should have been released at the same time, since their art styles were so similar, but by the time Heretic came out, Quake was about to be released, and the public was expecting the art style of Quake for all FPSs from id Software from that point on, so it kinda sank the franchise from the get-go. Plus, it had a shareware version, as was the norm for id Software, and a retail version known as Shadow of the Serpent Riders. But the quasi-sequel is what a lot of individuals are familiar with. It was called Hexen Beyond Heretic and was released in 1995. It was a major release that was put on the PC, Saturn, PlayStation 1, and the Nintendo 64, and was totally different experience from Heretic. The PC version is often considered to be the best, and Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 versions were fantastic in their own right, but the Saturn version was lacking in many departments. Given the success of Hexen, they released a sequel using the brand new Quake engine known simply as Hexen 2. I personally enjoy the game, but feel free to check it out. The most recent game in this franchise was Heretic 2, and it was 80,000 times better than Heretic 1, and this time takes place in a third-person perspective. Using the Quake 2 engine, this game was just better, to the point where ZeniMax bought out id, Raven Software found their balls and actually fought for their work, but because Raven developed the game and id published it, the fight continues to this day.
Uh-oh, it's time to talk about Quake. Well, where do we begin? Well, the first game was released in 1996 by GT Interactive, which, if you don't know, became this company. Yeah. Anyway, you play as the Ranger, who is tasked with fighting their way through mazes and medieval environments while taking on a bunch of monsters. Fun fact, the music was composed by Trent Reznor, the foreman for Nine Inch Nails, and Reznor himself even voiced the protagonist. It was ported to everything appropriate in the time, and 273,936 copies were sold in 1997, and the game itself grossed about 1.1 million units to date, aka, it was fucking awesome. The sequel, Quake 2, is not a direct sequel, but many of the mechanics remain the same. The storyline was a little bit different, but instead of a medieval surrounding, we were in like this science fiction themed environment. You play as a bitter man, who is attempting to prevent an alien invasion of Earth. The music this time was composed by Rob Zombie, and much like its predecessor, it was massively successful. The only game to beat at the time was Riven. 2 years later, Quake would take a multiplayer direction with Quake 3 Arena. Now bear in mind, Quake was already known for its insane multiplayer capabilities, but this one was exclusively multiplayer. This game kind of lit the flame for competitive online play and was used extensively in professional esports competitions. Some time would pass before we would see another Quake, and in 2005, Quake 4 was released. Again, in this game, we fight the same alien race, the Strogg, playing as Matthew Kane, who was part of the Rhino Squad, an elite squadron of Marines tasked with protecting the world from aliens. Again, it was a great game, but it had many issues with graphical performance. This even irritated John Romero, who expressed displeasure at the direction of the game. Enemy Territory Quake Wars would be the first Quake game not developed by Raven Software, and this one is really different. It's still first person, but it's a class-based thing with team elements. Think of Unreal Tournament, but made by Activision. Much like Quake 4, the public wasn't incredibly impressed, but that didn't keep them from playing it. The concept of Quake was slowly fizzling out, and to prevent that from happening, ZeniMax wanted a new entry in the series that would regain the same magic as Quake 3. Its software answered this by re-releasing Quake 3 as Quake Live. It was a Steam standalone that has a pay-to-play aspect and was again the pinnacle of competitive esports. For those individuals who love Quake, be ready for a new game to be released called Quake Champions. Supposedly it comes out this year and is speculated to have a single-player mode. I'm stoked because Bethesda is publishing it, and if it's anything like the last Doom game, we have a lot to look forward to. Well, that's it for today's episode. I really hope that you like what you saw. Like I said, please give a shout out to the guys who helped me make this video, Fatal Frame Rate and Game Squad. Both of their Twitches are going to be down in the links below in the description section. And if you get a chance, you should totally check them out. Subscribe, follow, whatever you please. And once this video is on YouTube, also do not be afraid to subscribe to the YouTube channel. I release a lot of content. I've kind of been lazy lately because I got back from Japan. I'm trying to get my bearings straight again. But if you get a chance to subscribe on the YouTube channel, please do, because I release a lot of awesome content. The Fireside Chats mainly focus on retro games. Contemporary Corner, which I've been lazy as fuck at making, is about games from PS4 all the way back to pretty much PS1, Sega CD era. But that's enough out of me. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope you learned a little bit about id Software and its story. And until next time, keep the retro flame alive. From my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.